You are about to witness one of the most emotional stories ever told. The journey of a bitter and lonely man, Edward Grayson, who finds redemption in the final moments of his life in a completely unexpected way. Trapped in his mansion, isolated after losing everything, from his mobility to the love of his only son, Edward's world is turned upside down by the arrival of Jack Thompson, an ex-convict rejected by his own family. What seemed like a professional relationship full of challenges quickly turns into something much greater, as they discover their lives are more connected than they ever imagined. But how far will Edward's pride take him? And can Jack, despite his painful past, be the key to Edward finally reconciling with his estranged son? As secrets come to light and both face their deepest fears, they are forced to confront the truth about themselves and what really matters. In the end, when all seems lost, something surprising happens that will forever change their lives. Will Edward have enough time to right the wrongs of the past? And will Jack finally find the place he has always been searching for? Stay until the end to discover how one last chance can change everything. Don't miss a second of this story full of emotion, surprises, and lessons that will deeply touch your heart. The Grayson mansion, once vibrant with laughter and grand parties, was now shrouded in silent darkness. The wind blew through the empty corridors, carrying with it the memories of a distant past. Edward Grayson, once a vigorous and imposing man, now spent his days confined to a wheelchair, contemplating the vast estate that had once been his kingdom. Life had struck him in a cruel and irreversible manner. A car accident, which robbed him of the mobility of his legs, was merely the most recent blow. The first and most devastating had come years earlier when his wife Madeline passed away unexpectedly. Madeline was the pulsating heart of the Grayson mansion, a woman whose warm presence illuminated every corner of the house. Her premature death, a victim of a sudden illness, left Edward in a state of unbearable pain. The mansion, which once resonated with laughter and joy, had become a place of mourning. Edward never overcame the loss of the woman who was his companion in all things. With Madeline's death, part of Edward died alongside her. He sought refuge in work and his businesses, trying to fill the void she left, but nothing could erase the pain. Then came the second blow, the accident that left him paraplegic. Edward, who had always prided himself on his strength and independence, found himself suddenly confined to a wheelchair, dependent on others for the most basic tasks. This accident marked the beginning of his decline. Without Madeline by his side, he felt even more lost and vulnerable. But the final blow, the one that sealed his fate of bitterness, was the betrayal of his only son, David. David Grayson, the heir to the Grayson Empire, had always been Edward and Madeline's hope, the continuation of everything they had built together. However, after his mother's death, David began to distance himself. Over the years, the relationship between father and son deteriorated, culminating in a bitter inheritance dispute. David, in an act of rebellion and resentment, severed all ties with Edward, leaving him alone to cope with his emotional devastation. That betrayal still burned in Edward's heart, like a wound that would never heal. He had closed himself off from the world, rejecting any attempts at reconciliation. Loneliness became his only companion, and bitterness his only refuge. As he watched the shadows dancing on the walls of his room, Edward felt rage growing within him. The world had become a cold and empty place, and he saw no sense in anything anymore.
Everything I built, everything I fought for, and for what?
He murmured to himself, feeling the weight of loss. He knew that deep down his hostility was a shield, a barrier he had erected to protect himself from pain, but now it isolated him from any chance of redemption, and thus, trapped in his own fortress of resentment, Edward Grayson became more bitter, more distant, more solitary with each passing day. The morning in the Grayson mansion began with the quiet entry of Mrs. Jenkins into Edward's room. She maintained her usual demeanor, but something in her behavior indicated an unusual tension.
Mr. Grayson.
she began with a slight hesitation in her voice.
A new assistant is on the way. It was a suggestion from Mr. Carrington.
Edward looked up, surprised. Carrington, an old and discreet friend, did not usually involve himself in his personal affairs.
Carrington suggested? And why, exactly, has he decided to meddle in my life now?
Edward asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and irritation. Mrs. Jenkins, always calm and pragmatic, explained,
Mr. Grayson, Mr. Carrington found Jack Thompson during one of his visits to the social reintegration project he supports. Jack is an ex-convict who, according to Carrington, is desperately trying to start over. He mentioned that you need an assistant and thought that giving someone like Jack an opportunity could be beneficial for both.
Edward scoffed, clearly skeptical.
An ex-convict? Carrington must be joking. And does he really think I need help? I am perfectly capable of managing on my own.
But there was more to the story that Mrs. Jenkins needed to explain.
Sir, Mr. Carrington mentioned that Jack is particularly dedicated and humble. He believes that Jack, with his desperate need for a fresh start, could prove to be a good helper. Furthermore,
She paused, measuring her words.
Carrington thought that someone like Jack, who also carries a heavy burden, might understand and respect your space. He thought that perhaps over time you could find in him someone trustworthy.
Edward remained silent for a long moment. The idea of having an ex-convict working for him deeply unsettled him. However, he trusted Carrington's judgment, albeit reluctantly. Carrington was not the type of person to do something without thoroughly considering the consequences. If he had suggested Jack, he must have seen something in the young man that deserved consideration. When Jack finally arrived, Edward received him with a cold stare. The young man, of humble appearance and cautious gaze, seemed out of place in the grand mansion. Without allowing time for introductions, Edward began to unleash orders with a cruel tone.
I see you're an ex-convict.
He said sarcastically.
I hope you know that I do not tolerate incompetence here. If you do not do your job right, you will be out before the week is over.
Jack, with tense shoulders, nodded in silence. He knew he needed the job, that he had nowhere else to go, but Edward's hostility hit him deeply. Edward watched Jack's every move, looking for a flaw, something that would justify the disdain he felt. Yet there was something in Jack's expression that unsettled him. It was as if he were looking at a shadow of his own past, something Edward could not define but that disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. The mansion was a labyrinth of dark corridors and opulent rooms, filled with relics from a time when Edward Grayson was a respected and admired man. Jack, while performing his daily tasks, began to explore the corners of the estate, trying to understand the hostile environment he had found himself in. There was something oppressive about the mansion's walls, as if each stone carried a fragment of the pain that permeated Edward's heart. On a quiet afternoon, while cleaning a room that seemed forgotten for a long time, Jack came across a dusty portrait hanging on the wall. He paused, intrigued, and approached to take a closer look. The painting depicted a young man with a determined gaze, bearing an unsettling resemblance to himself. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The young man in the portrait had a disturbing similarity to him, the same jawline, the same intense gaze. At that moment, Edward entered the room, his presence announced by the sound of his wheelchair rolling over the wooden floor. He stopped upon seeing Jack in front of the portrait, and an uncontrollable fury took hold of him.
What do you think you're doing?
Edward shouted, his voice heavy with hatred. He advanced with difficulty, gripping Jack's arm with surprising strength for a man in his condition.
I told you not to meddle in my personal life.
Jack, taken by surprise, tried to apologize, but Edward did not want to hear it.
Never look at that portrait again.
He released Jack with a shove, his eyes blazing with rage and pain. Jack, shaken, stepped back, realizing that there was something much deeper and darker within that mansion than he had imagined. He had little idea that in that moment, he had touched a wound that Edward had kept as his greatest secret, the emptiness left by his son, whom he had lost not only physically but emotionally many years ago. Jack Thompson woke up in the small bed of the service room, his mind heavy with uncertainty. The previous night had been long and tense, marked by the hostile reception from Edward Grayson. The mansion, with all its grandeur and opulence, felt suffocating, almost as if the walls carried the weight of the painful memories that dwelled within. Jack, even accustomed to adversities, felt he was on the brink of an emotional battle he had never faced before. As he descended the stairs, he mentally prepared himself for another day of work. The need to keep that job was overwhelming. Without money, without family, without a home to call his own, Jack knew he could not afford to lose that opportunity.
I need to start over,
he thought, trying to convince himself that he could endure Edward's cruel treatment. He understood that despite the humiliations, it was better than returning to the streets or, worse, to prison. Throughout the day, Jack observed Edward from a distance, trying to understand the man who now dictated the rules of his life. There was something about Edward that intrigued him. Behind the sarcastic remarks and the stern gaze, Jack saw a deeply wounded man. The shadows under Edward's eyes, the way he avoided certain rooms in the mansion, all indicated a hidden pain, something that gnawed at his soul. Jack didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt that the old aristocrat carried immense sorrow, a wound that never healed. Perhaps, Jack thought, this pain was what connected them in some way, even if Edward didn't want to admit it. On a quiet morning, while cleaning Edward's office, Jack found a half-open drawer in one of the old desks. Inside, amid papers and personal items, was a worn leather diary with the initials DG embossed on the cover. Jack hesitated for a moment, feeling as if he were invading someone's privacy, but curiosity proved stronger. He knew that DG could only mean David Grayson, the son Edward never mentioned. Jack carefully opened the diary, his hands trembling slightly. The yellowed pages were filled with strong but hurried handwriting. He began to read, quickly realizing he was faced with a story full of pain and resentment. The early pages described David's youth, his aspirations, and the pride he felt in being a Grayson. But as Jack progressed through the reading, the tone shifted. The words became more bitter, the texts filled with resentment. Jack discovered that the relationship between David and Edward began to deteriorate after the death of Madeline, David's mother and Edward's wife. The young man felt suffocated by the expectation to follow in his father's footsteps, and when Edward began to impose his will even more after the accident, David finally broke away. The last entry was especially painful. David wrote about the final argument with his father when, in a fit of rage, he swore he never wanted to see Edward again. Absorbed in the reading, Jack didn't hear when Edward entered the office. Edward's harsh voice brought him back to reality.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
Edward's voice was cold, almost cutting, and his eyes burned with uncontained rage. Jack tried to explain, but the words got lost in his throat. Edward advanced toward Jack, yanking the diary from his hands with surprising force.
How dare you touch my son's things? This is none of your business.
Edward's face was red, his lips trembling with anger. He was about to explode, and Jack realized he had made a grave mistake. Jack was in a panic. Edward, still furious, threatened to fire him on the spot.
You have until the end of the day to get out of my house.
Edward shouted, pointing to the door with a trembling hand. Jack's mind raced, trying to find a way to avoid the worst. He knew that if he were thrown out, he would have nowhere to go. Despair filled his chest, and in a moment of impulse, he knelt before Edward, pleading for a second chance.
Please, Mr. Grayson, don't fire me,
Jack said, his voice breaking with emotion.
I have nowhere to go. I know I shouldn't have read the diary, but it was an accident, I swear. I just wanted to understand.
Edward looked down at him, still angry, but something in Jack's voice made him hesitate. Jack continued, tears now streaming down his face.
I understand what it's like to lose everything, Mr. Grayson. I know what it's like to have no one. I am nobody, and this is my last chance. Please, don't take this away from me.
Edward remained silent for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. He saw in Jack the same pain he carried, the pain of loss, of loneliness, of despair. Finally, Edward let out a long, weary sigh.
You can stay.
He said, his voice softer but still laden with bitterness.
But understand one thing, this doesn't change anything. You will disappoint me, just like everyone else. It's only a matter of time.
With those words, Edward turned the chair and left the office, leaving Jack kneeling on the floor, relieved but also aware that his stay in the Grayson mansion would always be hanging by a thread. As Jack slowly got up, he realized that, despite everything, he still had a chance. He didn't know how long he could keep the job, but he was determined to do whatever it took to avoid being thrown back into the cruel world he had tried to escape. And even though Edward didn't want to admit it, Jack knew that the old man, deep down, understood his pain better than anyone. This gave him a small spark of hope, something to cling to amidst the darkness that permeated that mansion. The days at the Grayson mansion followed a rigid and relentless routine, imposed by Edward, who seemed to take pleasure in pushing Jack to his limits. The tasks he assigned to the young man were nearly impossible, like cleaning the vast library in a single day or tending to the garden alone, a task that would typically require an entire team. Edward watched from a distance, looking for any sign of fatigue or failure in Jack, waiting for the moment when the young man would give up and prove that he was no different from all the others who had passed through his life. Jack, on the other hand, refused to give in. Each task, no matter how challenging, was completed with fierce determination. But the weight of the demands and Edward's constant hostility began to accumulate until Jack felt he was on the verge of exploding. There were moments when he almost broke down, but the desperate need to keep his job and prove his worth kept him standing. He knew his life depended on it. The breaking point came on a sweltering summer afternoon. Edward had ordered Jack to reorganize the entire basement, a space cluttered with old furniture, boxes of documents, and objects that seemed untouched for decades. The heat was suffocating, and the air in the basement was heavy with the smell of dust and mold. Jack worked tirelessly, moving heavy pieces of furniture and cleaning the stone floor as sweat dripped down his face and back. Hours passed, and Jack was exhausted. When Edward descended to inspect the work, he immediately began to criticize.
This is a mess. You haven't done anything right.
Edward shouted, pointing to a pile of boxes that Jack had yet to organize. Something inside Jack broke at that moment. He had endured insults, criticism, and impossible tasks for weeks, but the unfairness of that comment hit him like a physical blow.
I'm doing the best I can.
Jack exploded, his voice echoing through the basement.
You think you can treat me like trash, but I won't accept that in silence. You hide in this mansion, throwing your pain and anger onto others, but the truth is you're destroying yourself with this bitterness. You need to let go of the past before it consumes you completely.
Edward's reaction was immediate and fierce. He grabbed an old vase from a nearby shelf and threw it in Jack's direction, which narrowly missed him.
Don't tell me how to live my life.
Edward screamed, his voice laden with an almost animalistic fury.
You know nothing about pain, nothing about loss. You're just an insolent boy who has no idea what it means to truly suffer.
Jack stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to catch his breath. He had never seen such rage in someone, and for a moment he wondered if Edward was capable of something worse. But then he noticed something behind Edward's shouts and violent gestures, a deep sadness. The old man was lost in his pain, and Jack knew that any attempt to continue the argument would only worsen things. Instead of retaliating, he simply left the basement, leaving Edward alone with his fury and solitude. Jack climbed the stairs to his room with heavy footsteps. feeling as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. When he closed the door behind him, he collapsed onto the bed, and the tears he had been trying to hold back began to fall. It was a silent cry from someone who had suffered too much to openly display his emotions, but the pain was there, inescapable. Lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, Jack remembered his own story, how his life had fallen apart after the prison. The rejection from his family was still an open wound. His parents, his siblings, all had abandoned him, as if he were a stranger, someone they should be ashamed of. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The Grayson Mansion, despite its oppressive atmosphere, was the only place where he could hide from the world and try to rebuild his life, but now even that was at risk. As the tears rolled down, Jack wondered why life was so cruel. He had made mistakes, yes, but he was trying in every possible way to be a better person. All he wanted was a chance, an opportunity to prove he could be different. But Edward, with all his bitterness, seemed determined to strip away any hope that remained in Jack. On the other side of the mansion, in a distant and luxurious wing, Edward was in his room, his hands still trembling with anger. He sat in his wheelchair, staring intently at an old photo of Madeline and David on the mantelpiece. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of despair. Jack's words had pierced through his armor, and he could no longer ignore the fact that he was losing control of everything.
Madeline.
Edward whispered, as if he could conjure the image of his deceased wife.
What have I done? What have I become?
For the first time in years, he let the tears fall freely. The emotions he had suppressed for so long came rushing forth, and Edward cried until he felt there were no more tears to shed. Deep down, he knew Jack was right. Bitterness was consuming his life, but he didn't know how to stop, how to return to the man he once was. Night fell silently over the mansion, bringing with it a biting cold. Jack couldn't sleep, his mind racing with the emotions of the day. Edward's words still echoed in his head, each insult like a blade piercing his heart. He didn't know how much longer he could endure. In the silence of his room, Jack made a decision. He would leave. He couldn't continue to endure so much pain and disdain. Life in the mansion was becoming unbearable. Waiting for everyone to be asleep, Jack began to pack his few belongings into a backpack. Each movement was silent, careful, to avoid alerting anyone. He knew that once he stepped outside, he would have nowhere to go, but the thought of staying there was more terrifying than the unknown. With the backpack on his back, he opened the door to his room and started down the stairs, ready to leave the mansion and everything it represented behind. But then, just as he was about to reach the exit, he heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was Edward in his room calling for David. Jack stopped in the middle of the hallway, his heart racing. He didn't want to listen, but Edward's words were filled with anguish, a suffering that seemed to tear through the silence of the night.
David, don't go, please. Don't leave me alone.
Jack froze, as if his legs had been nailed to the floor. This was not the angry, bitter man he knew. This was a desperate father, calling for the son he had lost. Jack felt a knot tighten in his throat. He knew what it was like to be abandoned, to cry out for someone who would never return. Suddenly, his own pain seemed small in comparison to the torment Edward was experiencing. Jack couldn't leave Edward alone, not like this, not now. Taking a deep breath, Jack climbed back up the stairs. He knew that by choosing to stay, he was putting himself in a difficult position, but something within him, a strength he didn't know he possessed, compelled him to stay. Perhaps in some way he could help Edward find a little peace, just as he was trying to do for himself. With a heavy soul but determined, Jack returned to his room, resolved to face another day in the Grayson Mansion. Night fell over the Grayson Mansion with a dark intensity as thick, dark clouds gathered in the sky. Soon, the distant rumble of thunder began to reverberate, echoing through the walls of the old house. The storm arrived with force, bringing with it violent winds and torrential rain. Inside the mansion, Jack and Edward felt the impact of the storm when the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the house into almost total darkness. Edward was in his room as usual, sitting in his wheelchair by the window, watching the heavy rain. He had grown accustomed to solitude, but the sudden darkness made him feel even more vulnerable. A man used to controlling everything around him was now at the mercy of nature, and the loss of electricity left him trapped, unable to move through the mansion on his own. With no alternative, Edward swallowed his pride and called for Jack, knowing he was the only person who could help him. Jack, who was in his room, heard the call and quickly descended, finding Edward in the hallway, trying in vain to navigate the dark.
Mr. Grayson, I'm here.
Jack said, approaching quickly.
I'll take you back to your room.
With Jack's help, Edward returned to his room. The shadows surrounded them, illuminated only by flashes of lightning that briefly lit up the mansion. Sensing the tension in the air, Jack lit a few candles to bring a little light to the environment. They fell into silence for a few minutes, merely listening to the roar of the storm outside. But the darkness, combined with their forced proximity, created a sense of intimacy that neither could avoid.
It's a hell of a night out there.
Edward murmured with a tired sigh. Jack, trying to ease the tension, replied with a slight smile.
Yes, sir. I think we're stuck here for a while.
The small conversation broke the barrier that usually existed between them. Jack knew that deep down, Edward was tired of feeling isolated, and the storm created an opportunity for a connection to form, if only for a brief moment. As the night wore on, Jack began to speak almost without thinking.
You know, Mr. Grayson, I know about David. I know you had a fight and then he left.
Edward froze for a moment, his expression hardening. But before he could say anything, Jack continued, his voice low and filled with emotion.
I understand what it's like to be rejected by someone you love. My family, they also left me after I was imprisoned. They wanted nothing to do with me. So, I think I know a little of what you're feeling.
The silence that followed was heavy, as if both were processing the depth of Jack's confession. Edward, who had always kept his emotions locked away, felt something break inside him. For the first time, he found himself confronted with the reality that another person understood the pain he carried. It left him uncomfortable, but at the same time there was a strange relief in knowing he was not completely alone in his suffering. The wind howled outside while the candle flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls of Edward's room. After what felt like an eternity, Edward broke the silence, his voice sounding softer than ever.
David. He meant everything to me after Madeline died. But I was hard on him, more than I should have been. He was young, full of ideas, and I just wanted him to follow in my footsteps, to be the man I wanted him to be.
The words came out slowly, as if Edward was digging deep within himself to find the strength to say what he had never said to anyone.
After the accident happened, I became bitter, angry. I wanted him to take charge, but I couldn't express that in a way he could understand. Instead, I pushed him away. We fought, and he said things that I know weren't true, but they hurt. He told me he hated me and never wanted to see me again. At that moment, I lost him.
Jack listened in silence, each word of Edward hitting him hard. He had never seen the old man so vulnerable, so exposed.
Mr. Grayson, I'm sorry. I can't imagine how hard it must have been for you.
Jack's voice was filled with genuine empathy.
But maybe there's still a chance to fix things. You could try talking to him, try to make amends.
Edward shook his head slowly, as if he were trying to dismiss the idea.
I don't know if he would listen to me now. So much time has passed, and I could never forgive myself for being so hard on him. When I see you, Jack, I see what could have been different. You remind me so much of him, the way he used to be, before all of this. And that's why I've been so hard on you. Because every time I look at you, I see my son and everything I lost.
Edward's words fell like a revelation for Jack. He finally understood why Edward was so hostile towards him, why he always seemed to be looking for flaws. Edward was trying to cope with the pain of losing his son, and Jack had somehow become an involuntary substitute for that broken relationship. Jack, touched by the confession, moved closer to Edward and with a firm voice said,
I'm not David, Mr. Grayson, but I'm here, and I'm willing to help you get through this. I also need a second chance, and maybe we can help each other find a way.
Edward looked at Jack, and for the first time, his eyes were not filled with anger or distrust, but with a silent acknowledgement of the truth. Jack wasn't his son, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could be the friend Edward never knew he needed. The storm finally began to calm, and with it, the tension that had hung between the two men. The darkness still enveloped the mansion, but somehow the atmosphere felt less oppressive. The wind that had once howled was now just a whisper, and the rain, which had pounded against the windows, now fell softly, as if it were tired. Edward, still shaken by the intensity of the conversation, looked at Jack with a mix of exhaustion and relief.
It seems the storm is passing,
he said, trying to break the silence that followed his confession.
Why don't you go down to the kitchen and get something to drink? I think we need a toast to something.
Jack, surprised by the invitation but grateful for the change in tone, nodded and went to fetch a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. When he returned, Edward had moved away from the window and was now by a small table near the fireplace. Jack poured the drinks and handed a glass to Edward. They toasted in silence, each lost in their own thoughts.
You know,
Edward said after taking a sip,
I don't usually talk about David. Not with anyone. But today, somehow, it was different. Maybe because you really understand.
Jack nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey.
I think we both know what it's like to carry a burden that's too heavy. But what matters is what we do from now on. We can't change the past, but maybe we can find a way to move forward.
Edward looked at Jack, seeing in him a mirror of his own flaws and hopes.
Maybe you're right.
He said with a weak but genuine smile.
Maybe it's time to stop living in the past and start thinking about the future.
They spent the rest of the night talking, sharing stories and experiences they had never shared with anyone else. There was a silent truce between them, a mutual understanding that they were both searching for something that had eluded them for so long. Peace. When electricity finally returned and the lights came on, the darkness inside the mansion had been replaced by a new light, a glimmer of hope. Edward and Jack, though still marked by their pasts, found in that night something that brought them closer, something that could, with time, heal the wounds they both carried. The tension in the Grayson mansion, which had once seemed almost palpable, began to ease after the stormy night. The silent truce between Edward and Jack, which had emerged that night, brought a new type of interaction between the two. However, there remained a weight that Jack carried with him, a secret that haunted him, and as time passed he began to feel the need to share. On a cloudy afternoon, while the two were in Edward's office, Jack finally decided that it was time to reveal his story. He was organizing some papers while Edward reviewed old documents. The silence between them was comfortable, but Jack knew that what he was about to say could change everything.
Mr. Grayson,
Jack began, his voice hesitant. Edward looked at him, sensing the seriousness of his tone.
there's something I need to tell you. Something that might change the way you see me.
Edward leaned forward, interested but also concerned. He could see the anxiety in Jack's eyes.
I am not who I seem to be.
Jack continued, struggling to find the right words.
I made mistakes, big mistakes. I was in prison, as you know, but what you might not know is why. I was arrested for theft. I was desperate, out of money, with no one to support me, and I ended up committing a crime that got me sent to prison.
Edward fell silent, watching Jack carefully. He already knew that Jack had a dark past, but hearing the young man confess the details brought a new dimension to the story.
But it wasn't just that.
Jack continued, his voice trembling.
My family, my mother, they all abandoned me after I was arrested. They turned away from me as if I were a plague, as if I were a shame. I tried to ask for forgiveness, tried to explain that I was desperate, but no one wanted to listen. I was completely alone, and when I got out of prison, I had nowhere to go. Every day I fought against the fear of being rejected again, the fear that I didn't deserve a second chance.
As Jack spoke, Edward felt a tightening in his chest. The young man's words struck him deeply, bringing forth painful memories of his own relationship with David. Rejection, loneliness, despair. Edward recognized all of it. He too had felt that way, lost in his pain, unable to fix what he had broken with his son.
Jack,
Edward finally said, his voice low and filled with emotion.
you are not the only one who has made mistakes. I have also failed my son. I was too hard on him, and in the end, he distanced himself. When I see you, I see the similarities, the pains that we both carry. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve a second chance. We all do.
Jack looked at Edward, surprised by the empathy and understanding in his words. For the first time, he felt that someone truly understood him, that he was no longer alone in his struggle. The confession, though painful, brought a new closeness between the two, a bond formed by shared pain and the hope for redemption. From that day on, something changed between Edward and Jack. Edward, touched by Jack's vulnerability, decided he wanted to do something to help the young man get back on his feet. He saw in Jack a reflection of the son he never truly got to guide, and this awakened in him a desire to pass on his knowledge and life experiences.
Jack,
Edward said one morning while they were sitting in the living room.
if you want to have a second chance in life, you'll need more than hard work. You need to understand how the world works, how money and business work. I can teach you that, if you're willing to learn.
Jack, initially surprised by the offer, accepted gratefully. He knew this was a unique opportunity, something that could change the course of his life forever, and so the lessons began. Edward taught him about finance, investments, and the art of negotiation. He showed Jack how to run a business, how to think strategically, and how to avoid the mistakes he himself had made in the past. To Edward's surprise, Jack proved to be an exceptional student. The young man absorbed the knowledge with a quickness and understanding that amazed him. Jack not only followed Edward's instructions, but also asked insightful questions, demonstrating a natural intuition for the business world. Edward, who initially saw this as a way to help Jack, began to realize that he was enjoying teaching, that he had finally found purpose again.
You have talent, Jack.
Edward said during one of their sessions, admiring the young man's progress.
With time and experience, you could be very successful. Perhaps even more than I ever was.
Jack was flattered, but also deeply touched. He knew that Edward's words came from a place of sincerity and respect. This was not just a lesson about business, it was a transfer of trust, an acceptance that Jack had longed for his entire life. As the days went by, the bond between the two men grew stronger. Edward began to see Jack not just as an assistant, but as a prototype of the son he always wanted, but never had the chance to truly educate. And for Jack, Edward became more than an employer. He became a mentor, someone who believed in him when no one else did. As time passed, Jack began to express his gratitude in more tangible ways. He not only dedicated himself to the lessons and work, but also started to take care of Edward on a more personal level. He began preparing meals for the old aristocrat, ensuring that he had a balanced diet and took his medications regularly. Edward, who had always been an independent man, initially resisted this new dynamic. He did not like being cared for, depending on someone for his daily needs. However, the gentle and respectful way Jack did things began to break down his defenses. Edward realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not alone. He had someone who genuinely cared for him, not out of obligation, but by choice. One morning, as Jack served breakfast in the dining room, Edward watched him with a soft expression that he rarely showed.
"Jack,"
he said, his voice betraying a hint of emotion.
"I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I'm grateful you're here."
Jack, surprised by the unexpected comment, smiled.
Mr. Grayson, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You've given me a chance that no one else would. And I'm not just talking about the job, but the opportunity to become a better person.
Edward nodded, touched by Jack's words. He knew that gratitude was mutual, that they were both helping each other heal wounds that might never completely close but could, over time, hurt less. Edward would not easily admit it, but he began to see Jack as a kind of son, someone he could guide and care for, even if silently. As the sun rose over the Grayson mansion, illuminating the once gloomy rooms and corridors, a new hope emerged between the two men. Edward and Jack, each in their own way, were finding a new purpose, a new reason to move forward. And in that large, old house which had been the backdrop for so much pain, something new and unexpected was blossoming. A connection that went beyond work and obligations, a genuine friendship built on the ashes of the past. Winter arrived at the Grayson mansion, bringing with it a biting cold that seemed to seep into the walls and the souls of those who lived there. Edward Grayson, once a man of indomitable vigor, began to slowly succumb to the relentless pressures of age and illness. Jack, who had become his faithful assistant and companion, noticed the changes gradually but undeniably. Edward, already physically weakened, now seemed even more worn down. His movements became slower, and the vitality that remained began to fade. Jack observed everything with growing concern. He noted Edward's difficulty in breathing, the moments when he lost his breath simply from the effort of climbing a ramp in the mansion or trying to get up from his wheelchair. Edward's sleepless nights, marked by dry coughs and long silences, made Jack question whether the man he had come to admire was finally yielding to what he had always denied: his fragility.
Mr. Grayson, I think we should call a doctor.
Jack suggested one morning while helping Edward get dressed.
You seem to be getting worse every day, and I'm worried.
Edward, who was already in a foul mood, looked at Jack with an expression of irritation.
"Jack, I don't need a doctor,"
he retorted, his voice weaker than he would have liked.
"I know what my body is telling me. I don't need a stranger to tell me what I already know."
But, Mr. Grayson,
Jack insisted, trying not to show the worry that tightened his heart.
if we don't do something now, this could become much more serious. I don't want to lose you.
Those last words escaped his lips uncontrollably, and upon realizing them, Edward fell silent for a moment, touched by the sincerity in Jack's voice. However, the stubbornness that had always characterized Edward prevailed.
"I'd rather die in this mansion, in the place where I've lived my whole life, than wither away in a hospital, surrounded by machines and strangers,"
he declared firmly.
"That is something you'll have to accept, Jack. I don't need your pity."
Jack wanted to argue, wanted to convince Edward to seek help before it was too late, but he knew it would not be easy. Edward was a proud man, and his desire to maintain control over his own life, until the very end, was something Jack understood, but also feared. One night, after another exhausting day of caring for Edward, Jack realized he could not continue waiting for the old aristocrat to change his mind. He decided to take action on his own, fully aware that this could cause a conflict between them. Determined to do something, Jack left the mansion and headed to town in search of medical help. The walk to the town was difficult. Winter had transformed the roads into slippery paths, and the biting wind whipped Jack's face, making each step feel like a battle. When he finally reached the nearest village, he went straight to the local pharmacy. The atmosphere there was tense. The pharmacist looked at Jack with suspicion, recognizing him as the ex-convict who had been seen in the company of Edward Grayson.
I need medications.
Jack said, trying to stay calm despite the hostility in the air.
It's for Mr. Grayson. He's very ill.
The pharmacist hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the idea of helping someone he saw as a criminal.
And why didn't Mr. Grayson come here himself?
He asked, his voice heavy with suspicion.
He can't leave the mansion.
Jack replied, feeling anger begin to rise.
And I can't waste time arguing with you. He needs these medicines.
The argument began to draw the attention of the few customers in the store. Whispers spread, and Jack realized he was being judged for his past, something he constantly feared. However, determined not to leave empty-handed, Jack insisted. He knew he could not fail. Finally, after a tense exchange of words and glances, the pharmacist relented, more out of compassion for Edward's condition than any respect for Jack.
All right,
The man said, packing the medications.
but don't expect this to happen again.
Jack took the bag of medicines and, despite the tension, thanked him before leaving. Before returning to the mansion, Jack made a quick visit to a local doctor's office. He explained Edward's symptoms and asked for advice on how to proceed. The doctor, though also reluctant due to Jack's reputation, offered basic guidance and emphasized the urgent need for more in-depth medical care. Jack knew that convincing Edward would be the toughest part, but he was willing to face the old man's anger if it meant saving his life. When Jack returned to the mansion, he was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He found Edward in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, his face pale and his eyes closed. Placing the medications on the table, Jack began preparing the recommended doses. However, upon hearing the sound of the bottles being opened, Edward stirred and looked at him with a mix of confusion and anger.
What is this?
Edward asked, his voice laden with distrust.
Where did you get these medicines?
I went to town.
Jack replied calmly.
I got the medications you need, and I also spoke with a doctor. He gave me some guidance on how we can treat your symptoms.
Edward tried to rise from his chair, but weakness caused him to fall back.
You went to see a doctor without my permission?
He roared, his voice hoarse.
I told you I didn't want medical help, Jack. You disobeyed my orders.
Jack stepped closer, unafraid of Edward's fury.
Yes, I disobeyed.
He admitted.
Because I care about you. Because I can't just stand by and watch you wither away without doing anything. I've lost too many people in my life, and I'm not going to lose you too.
Jack's words struck Edward like a blow. He had never heard anyone speak with such passion and sincerity on his behalf. For a moment, the old aristocrat fell silent, struggling against the emotion that threatened to overflow. Jack, seeing vulnerability in Edward, sat down beside him and continued.
Mr. Grayson, I understand that you want to maintain your dignity, that you don't want to feel weak. But that doesn't mean you should suffer alone. I'm here to help if you let me.
Edward finally yielded, his eyes filling with tears that he fought to hold back.
I didn't want to reach this point, Jack.
He said, his voice finally wavering.
I've always been strong, always had control, but now I don't know what to do.
Jack placed his hand on Edward's shoulder, a simple gesture but full of meaning.
You don't have to do this alone.
Jack said with a quiet firmness.
We'll get through this together.
After a long silence, Edward began to speak, revealing the truth about his relationship with David. He told Jack how he had always been demanding and harsh with his son, expecting him to be the perfect heir, without considering David's own wishes and dreams. The final fight that had separated them forever was still an open wound in Edward's heart, a guilt he carried every day. Jack, listening to the story, felt a deep sadness for Edward, but also an understanding that went beyond words.
Mr. Grayson,
He said with tears in his eyes.
you need to forgive yourself. You did the best you could, even if you made mistakes. If you can't forgive yourself, you'll never be able to move forward.
The two men, marked by their losses and regrets, embraced, a gesture that symbolized not only forgiveness, but also the acceptance that they both needed healing. In that moment, the Grayson mansion, which had always been a place of pain and isolation, became a space of connection and renewal. Edward, for the first time in many years, felt an inner peace he had forgotten how to experience. And Jack, who had always sought redemption, knew that by helping Edward, he was finding his own redemption as well. Winter was no longer just a season at the Grayson mansion. It had become a permanent part of Edward's life. The cold came not only from the wind blowing through the old windows, but from the very deterioration of his health. Edward, always proud and strong, now felt the weight of the years and the illnesses he had never properly addressed. He knew his time was running out, that the vitality that once defined his life was quickly fading away. In the days that followed the confession about David, Edward began to prepare for the inevitable. He could no longer ignore the signs his body was giving him. The constant fatigue, the chest pain that came and went, the sleepless nights where sleep felt like an unattainable luxury. Edward realized he needed to get his affairs in order, that the time to leave everything settled was running out. One afternoon, while snow fell outside and the fire crackled in the fireplace, Edward called Jack for a serious conversation. He was sitting in his wheelchair, looking at the flames as if seeking some answer he already knew by heart. When Jack entered the room, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken meanings.
Jack.
Edward began, his voice sounding weaker than usual.
We need to talk about the future.
Jack frowned, worried, but listened in silence.
I know my time is running out.
Edward continued.
I feel it in every fiber of my being. There's nothing more that can be done to change that.
Jack opened his mouth to protest, but Edward raised his hand to stop him.
No, Jack. You don't need to try to convince me otherwise. I've accepted this. And that's why I need to tell you something.
He paused, as if the words were difficult to pronounce.
I always thought I would die alone, bitter and with no one by my side. But then you came along.
Edward looked directly into Jack's eyes, and Jack felt the gravity of that moment.
You entered my life in a way I never expected.
Edward said, his voice laden with emotion.
I considered you like a son, Jack. Something I thought I would never do again. And I want you to know that in the last few months, you were the best thing that happened to me. You gave me a reason to keep fighting, even when everything seemed lost.
Jack felt tears begin to well up in his eyes, but tried to maintain his composure.
Mr. Grayson, Edward, I never thought I would hear something like this from you. But please, don't speak as if you've already given up. I promise I will be here, by your side, until the end, but we can't just accept this without fighting.
Edward smiled, a sad smile, but full of gratitude.
I know you're here, Jack. And that's more than I could ask for. But I need you to understand that it's not just about fighting against the inevitable. It's about accepting what comes next. And I need you to promise me something.
Jack nodded, his heart tightening.
I want you to live, Jack. Live the life I couldn't live. Be happy, find what makes you feel whole. Because if you do that, then perhaps, in some way, I too will have found my peace.
Jack could no longer hold back the tears. He knelt by Edward's side and held his hand, promising that he would never leave him. And in that moment, a new connection formed between them, something deeper than any work or friendship relationship. It was the bond of two men who, despite everything, found within themselves the capacity to love and to redeem. That night, Jack retreated to his room, but sleep evaded him. He was restless, the weight of the conversation with Edward pressing on his mind and heart. There was something in those last few days, something that felt like it was heralding an imminent change, and Jack could not shake the growing fear he felt. He was tired, exhausted both physically and emotionally, but his concern for Edward kept him from resting. Around 3 a.m, when the mansion was shrouded in almost total silence, Jack heard a sound that made his heart race. It was a scream, filled with pain and despair. He recognized Edward's voice, and without a second thought, ran down the hallway to the old man's room. When Jack opened the door, he found Edward lying in bed, the sheets tangled around his sweating body. His eyes were wide with terror, and he was murmuring David's name repeatedly, as if trapped in a nightmare from which he could not escape. Jack rushed to him, taking Edward's hand and trying to wake him.
Edward, it's me, Jack. You're safe. It's all right.
Jack said, his voice filled with urgency. But Edward seemed not to hear. He continued to murmur his son's name, as if living that final and painful moment of separation once again. Suddenly, Edward convulsed, and Jack realized something was very wrong. Edward's face was pale, and his breathing had become irregular. Jack felt panic rise up his spine as he watched Edward's body convulse.
No, this can't be happening.
Jack thought as he tried to revive him, adjusting Edward's position and checking his breathing. But it was clear to Jack that Edward was in critical condition. The scene before him was terrifying. Edward, the strong man he had learned to respect, was on the brink of death.
Edward, please, stay with me.
Jack pleaded, his voice full of despair.
I promised I would be by your side. Don't go now, please, don't go.
Edward opened his eyes for a brief moment, pain evident in his expression. He tried to speak, but the words came out as a faint whisper.
Jack, you were the best thing that happened in my life in the last years. I am proud of you, my son.
And then, as if the weight of the world had finally defeated him, Edward closed his eyes and his breathing began to fail. Jack, unable to bear the thought of losing Edward at that moment, sprang into action. With trembling hands, he grabbed the phone and dialed emergency services, urgently requesting an ambulance.
It's an emergency. Please come quickly.
Jack shouted, desperation spilling over in every word. He knew time was essential, that every second that passed could mean the difference between life and death. While he waited, Jack did everything he could to stabilize Edward. He remembered the instructions he had received from the doctor in town, the lessons he learned about first aid. He adjusted Edward's position, trying to keep his airways open, and placed a blanket over him to keep him warm. Edward was weak, his breathing irregular and shallow. Jack held his hand tightly, trying to convey some form of strength and hope through the touch.
I'm here, Edward. I promised I wouldn't leave you, and I won't.
Jack said, his voice now broken by the tears he could no longer contain.
Please, stay with me. We still have so much to do.
Finally, the distant sound of a siren sliced through the night, and Jack felt a wave of relief mixed with panic. The ambulance arrived quickly and the paramedics rushed into the room. They began to work on Edward, administering oxygen and checking his vital signs. Jack stood aside, watching, his heart racing so fast he felt it could explode. As the paramedics did everything they could to stabilize Edward, he opened his eyes once more, his hand still clutching Jack's.
Jack, live. Live the life I couldn't live. Be happy for both of us.
With those words, Edward closed his eyes again, a tear rolling down his face as the ambulance took him away. Jack, devastated, felt as if a part of him had been ripped away. But he knew he could not give up, that he needed to honor Edward's last wish. With a heavy heart, he followed the ambulance to the hospital, determined to fight for Edward's life until the very last moment, just as Edward had fought for his own redemption. The ambulance raced through the narrow, icy streets toward the hospital, its blue lights flashing frantically in the darkness of the night. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was tense, filled with the sounds of heart monitors and murmurs from the paramedics trying to stabilize Edward. Jack, sitting beside the stretcher, held Edward's cold hand tightly, as if his own touch could anchor him to life. As the vehicle zigzagged through the streets, Jack lost himself in thought. Edward's words echoed in his mind.
Live the life I couldn't live.
He couldn't shake the feeling of despair that consumed him. Edward, the man who had become his mentor and, in a way, a father figure, was on the brink of death, and the very idea of losing him was unbearable. Jack felt that for the first time in a long time, he had something to lose. Someone who truly cared for him, someone he had come to love like a father. As Jack silently prayed for Edward to survive, he reflected on everything he had learned in recent months. Edward had taught him much more than just business and finance. He had shown him what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity, how to find purpose amidst pain, and above all, how to forgive himself. Jack realized that through Edward, he had found a second chance at life, an opportunity to be a better person. And now, Edward's fate rested in the hands of the doctors, and Jack felt powerless, unable to do anything but wait and hope for his mentor to pull through. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Edward was quickly taken to the emergency room. Jack tried to follow, but he was stopped at the door by a nurse.
"You'll have to wait here.
She said, her voice firm but not without compassion.
We'll do our best to help him."
Jack nodded, but the feeling of helplessness left him paralyzed. He sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, his eyes fixed on the door through which Edward had disappeared, as his heart beat with an irregular rhythm, marked by anguish and uncertainty. The following hours were a torment for Jack. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, and the wait was almost unbearable. He ran his hands through his hair repeatedly, a desperate attempt to release some of the tension that consumed him. All he wanted was an answer, news, anything that would tell him Edward was okay. Finally, after what felt like centuries, the emergency room door swung open and a doctor stepped out. He looked around and, upon seeing Jack, approached him. Jack jumped to his feet, his heart in his throat.
How is he, doctor?
Jack's voice was a mix of hope and fear, his eyes pleading for good news. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a tired but kind face, gave a small smile of relief.
"It was a difficult surgery, but he survived,"
he said.
"Mr. Grayson was lucky. Your quick intervention made all the difference. If he had arrived a few minutes later, we might not have been able to save him."
The doctor's words hit Jack with a force almost physical. An overwhelming relief washed over his body, and he felt his legs weaken, almost unable to support him. The tears he had been holding back finally escaped, streaming down his cheeks as he thanked the doctor with a choked voice.
Thank you very much."
The doctor nodded, understanding the depth of Jack's emotion.
"He is stable now, but we will keep him under observation for a few days. You can see him, but he is still very weak, so try not to stay too long."
Jack agreed, wiping the tears from his face and trying to compose himself. He followed the doctor through the hallways to the room where Edward had been taken. When Jack entered the room, he found Edward lying in bed, pale but breathing softly. An indescribable relief washed over Jack as he saw him there, alive. He approached the bed and took Edward's hand, feeling the connection between them even stronger now.
"You made it, Edward."
Jack whispered, his voice filled with gratitude.
"You're a fighter, and I knew you would pull through."
Edward was not fully conscious, but Jack knew that somehow his mentor could sense his presence. He sat beside the bed, holding Edward's hand, and remained there in silence, letting the feeling of relief envelop him. Edward had survived, and with that, the hope that he could recover and continue to live was renewed in Jack. He felt in that moment that perhaps things could finally get better for both of them. The days that followed were marked by a slow but steady recovery. Edward, though still weak, was showing signs of improvement. Jack was always by his side, offering the support he knew Edward needed, even if the old man wouldn't admit it. Jack's constant presence was a silent reminder that, despite everything, Edward was not alone. Finally, on a quiet morning, Edward called Jack for a talk. Jack entered the room, noticing that something had changed in Edward's expression. There was a softness, almost a serenity, that he had never seen before. Edward gestured to a chair beside the bed, and Jack sat down, feeling that something important was about to be said.
"Jack,
Edward began, his voice still weak but firm.
I've been thinking a lot about life, about the choices I've made, about how I've lived until now.
He paused, looking out the window at the clear, sunny sky.
When I almost died, I realized how much I wasted. I lived with bitterness, resentment. I pushed away everyone who mattered to me, including my own son.
Jack listened in silence, feeling the pain in Edward's words.
I never had the courage to fix things with David.
Edward continued, sadness lacing his voice.
I always thought I had time, that somehow he would come back and everything would work out. But time passed, and I remained trapped in my pride. Now, after almost dying, I see how foolish I was.
Jack felt a knot tighten in his throat. He knew how much this confession cost Edward.
Mr. Grayson. Edward.
Jack said, his voice low but full of sincerity.
It's never too late. If you truly want to fix things with David, I'm here to help you. Let's find him and try to start over.
Edward looked at Jack, his eyes glistening with tears.
You always believed in me, Jack. Even when I didn't believe in myself. You gave me a second chance, and now, I think it's time for me to give that chance to myself.
He held Jack's hand tightly, as if finding in him the strength he needed to move forward.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for not giving up on me, for being by my side. I don't know what I would have done without you.
Tears that Jack had been holding back finally began to fall, but he didn't care.
I also need to thank you, Edward. You have given me so much more than you can imagine. I am no longer the same man who walked into that mansion months ago. And I know that together, we can find the peace we are both seeking.
The two men fell silent for a moment, sharing a deep understanding and a connection that transcended words. Edward, with tears in his eyes, knew that in some way he had found the redemption he had been searching for. And Jack, seeing Edward's transformation, realized that by helping his mentor, he too had found his own redemption. In that hospital room, surrounded by the soft light of the sun, Edward and Jack sealed a silent pact, the promise that, no matter what the future held, they would face it together, with hearts full of courage and renewed hope. Edward, with the weight of the past finally beginning to dissipate, felt a new determination growing within him. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving. He was beginning to live again, even if in a limited way and with time against him. But now that time felt more precious than ever because he knew he was not alone. After his recovery period in the hospital, Edward felt a new urgency in his heart. The near-death experience brought him brutal clarity about the priorities of his life. The peace he had found alongside Jack was precious but incomplete. There was still a shadow that needed to be dispelled, a wound that needed healing. He knew that if he wanted to leave this world in peace, he needed to fix the biggest mistake of his life, the separation from his son, David.
Jack,
Edward said, breaking the silence.
I want you to know that, no matter what happens, I trust you. I want you to continue what we started together. I want you to find David and help him understand that I deeply regret everything that happened. I want him to know that, despite everything, I have always loved him. If I can't fix this personally, you can, for me.
Jack squeezed Edward's hand, a gesture full of promises and silent resolutions.
I promise, Edward. I will do everything I can to find David and to make sure he knows how much you regret it and how much you love him. And I will do this not just for you, but for myself as well. Because you taught me that it's never too late to try to make things right.
Edward smiled, a genuine smile that was rare for him, but now blossomed with the sincerity that came from the depths of his heart.
Thank you, Jack,
he murmured, feeling a deep peace flood his being.
With you by my side, I feel that perhaps there is still hope to mend what was broken.
With Edward's instructions and the few contacts he still had, Jack began his search. He discovered that David, after years of estrangement, had moved to a small town in another state, far from any memories of the past, he was desperately trying to forget. The journey was not easy. Jack faced resistance from the few who knew David and who were aware of his desire to stay away. But Jack's determination was unwavering. He knew how much this reunion meant to Edward, and in a way, to himself as well. After days of searching, Jack finally found David's address. He got into his car and drove for hours, crossing unfamiliar landscapes until he finally arrived at the modest house where David lived. Jack took a deep breath before knocking on the door, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. When the door opened, he came face to face with a man who, despite the physical differences, immediately reminded him of Edward. David Grayson had the same intense gaze, but his eyes were marked by years of pain and regret.
David Grayson?
Jack asked, his voice calm but full of purpose.
My name is Jack Thompson. I came at your father's request.
David furrowed his brow, clearly taken aback.
My father? What do you want? I have nothing to do with him.
Jack extended a letter he had brought, written by Edward.
He is very ill, David. He doesn't have much time. Please, read this.
David hesitated, but took the letter. Jack remained silent while David read, watching the emotions change on his face: surprise, anger, pain, and finally, sadness. When he finished reading, David took a deep breath and looked at Jack, his eyes glistening with tears.
I thought I would never see him again.
He confessed, his voice choked.
But if he really wants to see me, I will go.
Jack, feeling a wave of relief and gratitude, nodded.
I will take you to him,
he said, sensing that finally the chance for redemption that Edward so desired was within reach. The drive back to the hospital was marked by a heavy silence. David was lost in thought, and Jack respected his space, knowing this was a pivotal moment. When they finally arrived at the hospital, David seemed hesitant, as if each step was a monumental effort. Jack guided him through the hallways to Edward's room, where the old man was waiting, aware that the meeting was about to happen. When David entered the room, time seemed to stop. Edward, sitting on the bed, raised his eyes and met his son's gaze. The two men stared at each other for a moment that felt like an eternity, each absorbing the image of the other, marked by time and distance. David was the first to speak, his voice trembling with the intensity of his emotions.
Dad,
was all he could say before the tears began to roll down his face.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for leaving, for letting things get to this point.
Edward, equally emotional, reached out his trembling hand to his son.
David, I'm the one who is sorry.
He replied, his voice choked.
I was a terrible father. I demanded too much from you, never listened to you, and ended up pushing you away. I never stopped loving you, son.
The distance between them was finally broken when David crossed the room and took Edward's hand, their bodies leaning into a tight embrace loaded with emotion. The tears that both had held back for years finally fell freely, washing away the pain and bitterness that had separated them for so long.
I wish I had come back sooner.
David said, his voice muffled by tears.
But I was so scared that it was too late, that you would hate me.
I never hated you,
Edward replied, his voice faltering as he stroked his son's hair as he used to when he was a child.
I was just afraid of losing you forever. But now you are here. And that is all that matters.
The moment was silent but filled with meaning. Jack, who observed the scene from a distance, felt a sense of relief and fulfillment he hadn't experienced in a long time. The reunion, the reconciliation between father and son, was what Edward needed to find peace. And for David, it was a chance to heal the wounds he had carried since leaving the mansion so many years ago. Days after the reunion, Edward was discharged from the hospital, and returned to his beloved mansion, now at peace with his past and with a lighter heart. He knew his time was running out, but now it no longer scared him. There was a serenity in his gaze that Jack had never seen before, a quiet acceptance of what was to come. On one of the days following his return, Edward requested that Jack and David meet with him in the study. He was seated at the old mahogany desk, a set of documents in front of him.
There's something I need to do before my time runs out.
Edward said, looking at the two men who had become the center of his life. Edward explained that he had decided to prepare his will, a final gesture of reconciliation and gratitude.
David,
he began, his voice steady.
I will leave the mansion, the family businesses, and most of my fortune to you. You are my son, and I trust that you will honor the Grayson name.
David nodded, visibly emotional.
I promise, Dad. I will do my best to honor your legacy.
Edward then turned to Jack, his eyes filled with gratitude.
Jack, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me. You not only saved my life, you gave me a new reason to live. For this reason, I will leave you a significant sum, in addition to a small property on the outskirts of town. There, you can build the life you deserve.
Jack, surprised and deeply touched, tried to protest.
Edward, this isn't necessary. I didn't do what I did for money. I did it because I care about you.
Edward smiled, a smile full of affection and respect.
I know that, Jack. And that's exactly why you deserve it. You are like a second son to me, and I want you to have the chance to live the life you've always wanted.
Edward's words hung in the air, filled with meaning and love. He signed the documents, formalizing his final wishes, and handed a copy to Jack and another to David.
Now, everything is in order.
Edward said with a sigh of relief.
I can leave in peace, knowing I leave everything settled.
Jack and David, with tears in their eyes, embraced Edward, feeling the depth of the moment. That final gesture of love and gratitude marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Edward, who had spent most of his life trapped in bitterness and regret, found the redemption and forgiveness he so desired. And Jack and David, united by this extraordinary man, promised to carry on his memory and legacy, living each day with the wisdom and love that Edward had taught them. The sun slowly set over the Grayson mansion, casting a golden light over the future that awaited Jack and David. And as they walked together, they knew that in some way, Edward would always be with them, guiding and inspiring them to live with courage, compassion, and hope. Years had passed since the last time Jack Thompson set foot in the Grayson mansion for a mission that would change his life forever. Now he was a different man, shaped not only by circumstances, but by the lessons of a mentor who taught him to see life through a new lens. Jack, who once struggled to find his place in the world, had become a successful man, known and respected in his community. With the inheritance that Edward Grayson left him, Jack not only survived, he thrived. He invested the money wisely, applying everything he had learned about business and finance from Edward. But more than that, Jack invested in people. He built companies that valued integrity, honesty, and hard work, creating opportunities for those who, like him, needed a second chance in life. Jack's companies became a model of ethical success, attracting attention and respect both locally and nationally. He employed ex-convicts, marginalized individuals, offering them not just jobs, but dignity. His own story of redemption served as an inspiration for many, and soon Jack Thompson became more than a successful businessman. He became a symbol of hope and resilience. The local community admired him. Jack was known for his generosity, for investing in social projects, and for always being willing to help those in need. He was not just a wealthy man, he was a man of value, someone who understood the true meaning of giving and receiving. And amid all the success, Jack never forgot where he came from, nor the person who helped him get to where he was. The memory of Edward Grayson was always present, guiding each of his decisions, like a moral compass. Despite all his business success, Jack always made a point to maintain a balanced personal life. He had built his own home on the outskirts of the city, a property that Edward had left him. It was a cozy house, far from the excessive luxury of the Grayson mansion, but full of warmth and life. Here, Jack found something he had never had before: a family. He married a woman who shared his values and understood his need to give back to the world what he had received. Together, they raised 2 children, to whom Jack taught the same lessons he had once learned from Edward. He raised them to be integral people, teaching them the value of hard work, honesty, and above all, compassion. Jack's life was filled with simple yet meaningful moments. Mornings were dedicated to family breakfasts, afternoons to work, and evenings to the stories he told his children, tales about a man who once showed him what was possible when someone believed in you. Frequently, Jack visited Edward's grave. He never failed to bring fresh flowers, a small way to show his gratitude. Each time he knelt before the grave, he recalled the moments that changed his life, the lessons, the confrontations, the deep conversations on quiet nights. And every time he faced a challenge in life, he would ask himself what Edward would do. These reflections guided him, as if Edward were still by his side, whispering advice and offering support. Jack knew that everything he had achieved was not just the result of his own effort, but also of the seeds Edward had planted in his soul. And for that reason, with each visit, he silently thanked him, feeling an inner peace that only those who achieve true redemption can feel. On a particularly sunny day, Jack felt an uncontrollable urge to visit the Grayson mansion. It had been years since he had been there, and now the place was inhabited by David, the son Edward had loved so much, and who had finally found his way back to his childhood home. Jack parked his car at the familiar entrance, observing how time had changed the place, but also how certain things remained the same. David, upon seeing him arrive, came out to greet him. The 2 men shook hands firmly and shared a smile full of camaraderie. Since reconciling with his father, David had turned the mansion back into a home full of life. The laughter and joy that had once been suffocated by pain and resentment now echoed through the halls.
It's good to see you, Jack.
David said, sincerity in his voice.
I hope you find the house in good shape.
It's more than fine, David.
Jack replied.
It's exactly how it should be. You're doing a great job here.
David smiled, and after exchanging a few words, Jack asked for permission to walk through the mansion alone. David nodded and let him embark on his journey of memories. Jack wandered through the halls, each step bringing back memories of the past, both painful and redemptive. He entered the library, where so many lessons had been learned, and then passed through the ballroom, where the shadows of the past were dispelled by the light of forgiveness. Finally, Jack found himself in front of Edward's portrait, the old aristocrat with his penetrating gaze and imposing posture. But as he looked at the portrait now, Jack no longer saw the bitter and distant man he had once known. He saw the mentor, the friend, the father he had always wished to have. A gentle smile formed on Jack's lips as he reflected on the journey they had both traveled.
I kept my promise, Edward.
Jack said in a whisper that seemed to resonate through the grand hall.
I lived the life you asked me to live, and I hope you have been proud of me, just as I am proud to have known you.
With those words, Jack felt a deep peace in his heart. He knew that although Edward was no longer physically present, his influence would continue to guide his steps and those of many others. As he left the mansion, Jack took one last look back, confident that wherever Edward was, he would be watching, smiling, and proud of everything his second son had achieved. As he walked away from the Grayson mansion, Jack felt that a cycle had been completed. He was ready to continue living, filled with purpose and gratitude, knowing that life, despite all its difficulties, had given him a second chance, a chance he would not squander. The story of Edward and Jack reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, there is always a chance for redemption and reconciliation. Sometimes love and forgiveness come from the most unexpected places, and the true legacy we leave is not in wealth, but in the connections we make. Have you reflected on second chances in your own life? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss new videos, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. And of course, watch the next recommended video by clicking the card on the screen. Thank you so much for watching.